David Berkowitz. For 1 full year, New Yorkers stopped going out at night. Couples avoided parked cars. Young women with long dark hair dyed it blonde, because somewhere in the 5 boroughs, a man with a .44 caliber revolver was choosing his victims, and nobody could figure out the pattern. He sent letters to the police, he sent letters to the newspapers, and he signed them with a name that would define an entire era of fear: Son of Sam. It started on July 29, 1976, in the Bronx. 2 young women, Donna Lauria and Jody Valenti, were sitting in a car outside an apartment building, talking the way people do at the end of an ordinary summer night. A man approached, pulled a revolver from a paper bag, and opened fire. Donna Lauria, 18 years old, lost her life. Jody Valenti survived. At the time, nobody connected it to anything larger. It looked like an isolated tragedy. But over the following months, the same scene repeated across Queens, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. In October, a young man named Carl Denaro was wounded. In November, 2 teenagers, Donna DeMasi and Joanne Lamino, were attacked outside a home, and Lamino was left paralyzed. In January of 1977, a graduate student named Christine Freund had her life taken. In March, a Columbia University student named Virginia Voskerichian was harmed fatally while simply walking home. By the spring, police understood they were dealing with a single gunman. The recovered bullets matched. The same .44 caliber Bulldog revolver was being used again and again. And the attacks shared a chilling signature: young people, often in or near cars, often women with dark hair. In April of 1977, after taking the lives of Valentina Suriani and Alexander Esau, the gunman left something new at the scene: a handwritten letter addressed to the police. In it, he called himself the Son of Sam, and he wrote in a strange, rambling voice about being commanded to keep going. He later began taunting Jimmy Breslin, a columnist at the Daily News, and the city devoured every word. The New York Police Department launched one of the largest manhunts in its history. They called it Operation Omega. 75 detectives were assigned to it directly, with more than 200 other department members supporting the effort, all led by Deputy Inspector Timothy Dowd. They chased thousands of tips and came up empty again and again. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did, not for a long time. The break, when it finally came, had nothing to do with the letters or the profiling. On the night of the final attack, in Brooklyn, where Stacy Moskowitz lost her life and Robert Violante was blinded in one eye, a woman named Cecilia Davis remembered something small. Police had been writing parking tickets near the scene. One of those tickets had gone to a yellow Ford Galaxy. That car traced back to a man in Yonkers named David Berkowitz, whose name had also surfaced in an unrelated harassment complaint. 2 threads, pulled at the same time, led to the same door. On August 10, 1977, officers waited outside his apartment. When they took him, he reportedly greeted them almost calmly, as if he had been expecting it. Inside, they found a rifle, ammunition, and maps of the crime scenes. Berkowitz pleaded guilty in May of 1978. He had claimed a neighbor's dog, supposedly possessed by a demon, had ordered the attacks, a claim that drew enormous attention, but did nothing to change the outcome. On June 12, 1978, he was sentenced to 25 years to life on each of the 6 counts, the terms to run consecutively. By the math the court laid out, that totaled hundreds of years. He would not be going home. He became eligible for parole in 2002 and has been denied at every single hearing since. His 12th denial followed a board interview in May of 2024. He no longer fights for release. He calls himself a born-again Christian now and says his focus is elsewhere. As of today, David Berkowitz is alive, in his early 70s, held at Shawangunk Correctional Facility in Ulster County, New York. Berkowitz wanted the world to know his name, and he got his wish through letters and headlines. But the next man on this list worked in the opposite direction. He spent 30 years making sure that no one knew who he was, and he nearly took that secret to the grave. Dennis Rader. He was a Cub Scout leader. He was the president of his church council. He was a married father of 2, a city compliance officer who measured people's lawns and cited them for code violations in a quiet Kansas suburb. His neighbors thought he was rigid, maybe a little self-important, but harmless. What none of them knew was that this man had given himself a name years earlier, a name built from 3 words describing exactly what he did to people: bind, torture, kill. The first attack came on January 15th, 1974, in Wichita, Kansas. Rader entered the home of the Otero family and took the lives of 4 people inside, including 2 children. There was no forced entry chaos, no robbery that made sense of it. It was methodical, and it was deliberate, and it left investigators with almost nothing to work with. Over the next 17 years, he took the lives of others: Catherine Bright in April of that same year, Shirley Vian in 1977, Nancy Fox later that same year, Maureen Hedge in 1985, Vicki Wegerle in 1986, and Dolores Davis in 1991. 10 lives in total, spread across nearly 2 decades, with long silences in between that made the case almost impossible to hold together. What made him different was the need for attention. He coined the name BTK himself in a letter left inside a library book back in 1974. He wrote to police. He wrote to news stations. He described his crimes in detail and complained when he felt he was not getting enough coverage. And then, around 1991, he simply went quiet, and the case went cold for more than a decade. It might have stayed that way forever. But in 2004, a newspaper ran a story marking 30 years since the Otero attack, and something in Rader could not resist. He resurfaced. He started sending packages again, almost as if no time had passed. And then he made the mistake that ended it. He asked the police, through a coded message in a classified ad, whether a floppy disk could be traced back to him. The police, of course, told him it was perfectly safe. It was not. When he mailed a disk to a local television station in February of 2005, investigators pulled the metadata off it. The file had been used at a place called Christ Lutheran Church, and it had last been edited by someone named Dennis. From there, it took almost no time. DNA from a sample belonging to his own daughter provided a familial match to evidence from one of the scenes. And no, I'm not making that up. After 30 years of taunting the people hunting him, Dennis Rader was undone by asking them for technical advice and trusting the answer. He was arrested on February 25, 2005. He pleaded guilty that June, and in a courtroom appearance that horrified the nation, he described his victims in flat clinical language, referring to them as projects. On August 18, 2005, he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms. Because his crimes predated the reinstatement of the death penalty in Kansas, execution was never on the table. With his sentences stacked, he has no realistic path to release. As of today, Dennis Rader is in his 80s, held largely in solitary confinement at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. In recent years, investigators in Oklahoma and Missouri have publicly named him a person of interest in older unsolved cases, though officials have said the evidence so far is not enough to charge him. His own daughter, who helped bring him to justice, has said she believes the true number of his victims may be higher than 10. Rader hid in plain sight for decades, inside one small community. But the next case shows what happens when there is no hiding at all. When a single man with legally owned firearms turns an entire English town into a killing ground in the span of a single afternoon. Michael Ryan. On an ordinary August day in 1987, a quiet market town in the English countryside became the site of one of the worst mass shootings in British history. The man responsible held legal certificates for the firearms he used. He had no criminal record that anyone treated as a warning. And by the time it was over, 16 people had lost their lives, including his own mother. and the laws of an entire nation would be rewritten because of what he did. His name was Michael Ryan. He was 27 years old, an only child, described by those who knew him as a loner, a man fixated on guns and military gear who lived with his mother in the town of Hungerford in Berkshire. At the time, he was licensed to own 8 firearms. To the authorities, he was simply a man who had passed the checks. It began around 12:30 in the afternoon in nearby Savernake Forest. A young mother named Susan Godfrey was there having a picnic with her 2 small children. Ryan approached her and harmed her fatally in front of them, then left the children alive. Those children would later tell rescuers, in the plain words of the very young, that a man in black had hurt their mother. From there, Ryan moved toward Hungerford itself. He stopped at a petrol station and fired on the cashier, missing her. He returned to his home on South View, where he took the lives of his neighbors Roland and Sheila Mason, harmed the family dog, and set the house on fire. And then, for roughly the next 2 hours, he walked the streets of the town with his weapons, moving from street to street. Among those who lost their lives was Police Constable Roger Brereton, shot in his patrol car as he responded to the emergency. He was later recognized posthumously for his bravery. Ryan also took the life of his own mother, Dorothy. In total, 16 people were harmed fatally, and 15 more were wounded before the violence ended. The response exposed how unprepared the system was for something like this. The region's armed police units were roughly 40 miles away on a training exercise. The police helicopter was out of service, under repair. The emergency phone lines were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of calls. For 2 hours, a town was left largely to fend for itself. That's not a typo, by the way. An entire community waited 2 hours for an armed response that was tangled up in circumstance and distance. Ryan eventually barricaded himself inside the John O'Gaunt School, a building he had once attended as a student. At just before 7 that evening, surrounded and out of options, he took his own life. Because Ryan was dead, there was never a trial. Instead, there was a reckoning. An official inquiry, what became known as the Hungerford Report, was prepared by the Thames Valley Chief Constable for the Home Secretary. It confirmed that his weapons had been entirely legal and recommended far stricter controls. That report led directly to the Firearms Amendment Act of 1988, which banned the ownership of semi-automatic center fire rifles and tightened the rules on certain shotguns. As of today, the Hungerford Massacre remains one of the defining moments in British firearms law, the event that made the country fundamentally rethink who should be allowed to own a gun. The town has long since rebuilt, but the names of the 16 are still read and still remembered. Ryan's violence was confined to a single afternoon in a single town. The next man crossed an entire country, leaving bodies in 4 different states, and the manhunt for him would end on the steps of one of the most famous mansions in America. Andrew Cunanan. In the summer of 1997, the FBI was hunting a man who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. He was charming, intelligent, and a practiced liar who had spent years living off wealthy, older men. In just under 3 months, he took 5 lives across 4 states, and his final victim was one of the most celebrated fashion designers in the world, shot dead in broad daylight on the front steps of his own home in Miami Beach. His name was Andrew Cunanan. He was born in 1969 in National City, California. By all accounts, he was strikingly smart and socially gifted, the kind of person who could walk into any room and make himself the center of it. He moved through the social scenes of San Diego using false names and invented backstories, often supported financially by older partners. But by the spring of 1997, he was abusing drugs and alcohol, running low on money, and running out of the lifestyle he had built on illusions. The violence began on April 27, 1997, in Minneapolis. His former friend Jeffrey Trail lost his life. Days later, in Minnesota, an architect named David Madsen was harmed fatally and left near a lake. Cunanan then moved to Chicago, where he took the life of a 72-year-old real estate developer named Lee Miglin. In New Jersey, he took the life of a cemetery caretaker named William Reese, apparently just to take the man's truck. And the timing of what happened next was almost too perfect for the headlines. On July 15, 1997, Cunanan walked up to the gates of Casa Casuarina in Miami Beach and took the life of Gianni Versace, the famous Italian designer, as he returned from a morning walk. The same handgun, stolen from his first victim, had been used through nearly the entire spree. By then, Cunanan had already been added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list, and his face had been featured on America's Most Wanted. And yet, somehow, he stayed hidden. He had been living in plain sight at a cheap hotel in Miami Beach, paying cash just a short distance from the very mansion where he would commit his most infamous act. After Versace, the manhunt intensified for 8 days. It ended on July 23, 1997. A caretaker reported an intruder on a houseboat just blocks from Versace's mansion. When authorities entered, they found Cunanan dead inside from a self-inflicted gunshot. He left no note behind, nothing that explained any of it. That absence is what makes the case linger. His motive was never confirmed. One widely circulated theory, that he was taking revenge over an HIV diagnosis, was disproven by the autopsy, which found he was not infected. Theories ranged from a craving for fame to jealousy to simple rejection, but the truth went into the water with him. Contemporary coverage was also criticized for the way it conflated his sexuality with his crimes and for poor coordination between police and the communities that might have helped catch him sooner. As of today, Andrew Cunanan's spree is remembered as much for its questions as its answers. 5 people lost their lives, and the one person who could have explained why made sure no one ever would. Cunanan took his secrets to the grave, and for decades the next case carried a different kind of uncertainty. A confession that the world accepted, a body in the ground, and a doubt that would not go away until science finally caught up. Albert DeSalvo. For 2 years in the early 1960s, the women of Boston lived behind locked doors. 13 of them lost their lives in a string of attacks that shared a horrifying signature, and the city gave the unknown man a name: the Boston Strangler. A man eventually confessed to all of it, but he was never tried for the crimes. He later took back his confession, and for 50 years the question of whether he was truly the Strangler haunted everyone who had lived through it. His name was Albert DeSalvo. He was an Army veteran and a married man, already known to police under 2 other unsettling nicknames for a series of earlier offenses. Between 1962 and 1964, 13 women across the Boston area, ranging widely in age, lost their lives in attacks that typically showed no sign of forced entry. The victims were strangled, often with articles of their own clothing. The final attack attributed to the Strangler took the life of 19-year-old Mary Sullivan in January of 1964. DeSalvo confessed in 1965 while he was being held for an unrelated series of offenses. He gave his account to a fellow inmate and through his attorney, the famous F. Lee Bailey. But here is where the case became strange, and stayed strange for half a century. He was never actually charged with the stranglings. He was convicted in 1967 for the separate offenses and sentenced to life in prison. The murders themselves were attributed to him almost entirely on the strength of his own words. And those words were not enough for everyone. Over the decades, serious doubts took hold. Researchers and a former FBI profiler argued that the 13 attacks did not fit a single offender, that the differences between them suggested more than one person was responsible. Some believed DeSalvo had confessed to crimes he did not commit. For reasons of his own, DeSalvo never got the chance to clarify any of it. On November 25, 1973, he was harmed fatally inside the infirmary of Walpole Maximum Security Prison. By then, he had already recanted his confession. A reputed gang figure was tried for the killing, but the jury could not reach a verdict. So the central question simply sat there, unresolved, for decades. The answer finally came in 2013, through science that did not exist when the crimes were committed. Using cold case funding and a specialized form of DNA analysis, Boston police tested a sample discarded by DeSalvo's nephew and compared it to seminal fluid preserved from the Mary Sullivan scene. It was a familial match. To be certain, authorities exhumed DeSalvo's body that July and tested DNA from his remains directly. According to the National Institute of Justice, specialists calculated the odds that a different white male had left that evidence at roughly 1 in 220 billion. And somehow, it gets worse, or at least more complicated. That extraordinary result settled one thing definitively. Mary Sullivan's murder is now firmly attributed to Albert DeSalvo, beyond any reasonable doubt. But the DNA only spoke to her case. The other 12 attributed killings remain officially uncharged, attributed to him largely through the confession he gave and later took back. As of today, Albert DeSalvo is conclusively tied to one of the 13, and the lingering doubt about whether he committed them all has never fully gone away. If you like this video and haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time to join. We post a new case every day, so hit subscribe and don't miss what's coming next. The Manson family. The man whose name became permanently attached to the most infamous killings of the 1960s was not actually present for the worst of them. He never personally took a life on the night the world remembers. He didn't have to. He had convinced a group of young, lost followers that an apocalyptic race war was coming, and that they were the ones chosen to light the match. His name was Charles Manson. In the late 1960s, he gathered a collection of drifters and runaways around him in California and formed what became known as the Family, based largely at a rundown movie set called Spawn Ranch. He preached a strange doctrine he called Helter Skelter, an end-of-the-world theory he claimed to have decoded from a Beatles album. He told his followers that the violence they committed would trigger the collapse he predicted. On the night of August 8th into the early hours of August 9th, 1969, he sent several of them to a home on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles. Inside, 5 people lost their lives, among them the actress Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant. The killings were carried out by Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel, with another follower acting as lookout. The next night, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were also harmed fatally in their home, with Manson present at the start before leaving others to finish. 2 more lives, those of Gary Hinman and a ranch hand named Donald Shea, were also taken by members of the family around the same period. The case broke open in an almost careless way. Susan Atkins, jailed on an unrelated matter, began talking to fellow inmates about what the group had done. Word reached investigators. The trial that followed, led by prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi, became one of the most sensational in American history, built around that bizarre, helter-skelter motive. You'd think someone would have said something long before it reached that point. Nobody did. On January 25, 1971, Manson, Watson, Krenwinkel, Atkins, and Leslie Van Houten were convicted, and all were initially sentenced to death. But those death sentences never came to pass. In 1972, a California Supreme Court decision invalidated the state's existing death sentences, and every one of them was commuted to life with the possibility of parole. That single legal shift is the reason this story is still unfolding more than 50 years later. Here is where each of them stands. Charles Manson lived out the rest of his life behind bars and passed away on November 19, 2017, at the age of 83, from natural causes. Susan Atkins lost her own life to brain cancer in custody in 2009. Leslie Van Houten, whose conviction was settled at a later retrial, was paroled in July of 2023 after 53 years, and was formally discharged from parole in August of 2025. She remains the only participant in the Tate and LaBianca killings ever released. The others are still inside. Patricia Krenwinkel has become the longest-serving female inmate in the California prison system. A parole panel recommended her release in May of 2025, but Governor Newsom reversed that decision in October. Tex Watson has been denied parole well over a dozen times. Bobby Beausoleil, tied to the Hinman killing, was found suitable for parole in early 2025, only for the governor to reverse it and a court to uphold that reversal in October. Bruce Davis has been found suitable 7 separate times, and each time, the sitting governor has blocked his release. And no, I'm not making that up. A panel can say a person is ready to go home, and a governor can simply override it over and over for years. For the Manson family, that tug of war has now stretched across multiple decades and multiple administrations. Manson sent others to do his killing while he kept his own hands clean, hiding behind a doctrine and a group of followers. The next man took the opposite approach entirely. He was a trained officer of the law who decided to wage a one-man war against the very institution that had employed him, and he wrote down exactly who he intended to hunt. Christopher Dorner. He had served in the Navy. He had worn the badge of one of the largest police departments in America. And in February of 2013, he published a long, detailed message online declaring war on that department, listing the names of dozens of people he intended to target. Over the next 9 days, Southern California would shut down in fear as a former officer used everything his training had taught him to evade the largest manhunt the region had ever seen. His name was Christopher Dorner. He had been a lieutenant in the Navy Reserve and an officer with the Los Angeles Police Department until he was fired. After the department concluded, he had filed a false report accusing his training officer of misconduct against a suspect. Dorner insisted the opposite, that he had told the truth and been punished for it. He appealed and lost. A state appeals court affirmed the decision against him in October of 2011. He became convinced the system had destroyed him, and he decided to answer it with violence. It began on February 3rd, 2013, in Irvine. Monica Kwan, the daughter of a retired police captain who had represented Dorner in his disciplinary case, and her fiancé Keith Lawrence, were found in their car, both harmed fatally. Days later, Dorner ambushed officers, taking the life of Riverside police officer Michael Crane and wounding his partner. The panic that followed produced its own tragedy. During the frantic search, jittery officers opened fire on people who had nothing to do with Dorner. 2 women delivering newspapers, Emma Hernandez and Margie Carranza, were shot and wounded. Another man, David Perdue, was fired upon as well. The city later paid millions of dollars in settlements over those shootings. That's not a typo, by the way. In the hunt for one man, officers shot innocent civilians whose only crime was driving a truck that vaguely resembled his. On February 12th, Dorner took the life of San Bernardino County Sheriff's Detective Jeremiah McKay and wounded a deputy. The message he had posted online ran to roughly 11,000 words. He framed it as a last resort and declared a kind of asymmetric warfare against the department, naming around 40 law enforcement targets. He even mailed a package to a CNN anchor containing a DVD and a coin from the department pierced by a bullet. The end came that same day, February 12, 2013, at a cabin in the Big Bear area. After a firefight involving more than 500 rounds, officers fired tear gas canisters into the structure and it caught fire. Dorner died inside from a self-inflicted gunshot. His identity was confirmed 2 days later through dental records. In the aftermath, the police chief reopened Dorner's old disciplinary case to examine whether the original firing had been justified. A review completed in June of 2013 concluded that it had been sound, finding that Dorner had indeed fabricated his allegations. Separately, the department determined that 8 officers had violated use of force policy in the shooting of the 2 innocent women, though no criminal charges followed. The case left a lasting scar on the city and a lasting debate about how the department handled discipline and dissent. Dorner announced his intentions to the entire world before he acted, leaving behind a written manifesto for everyone to read. The next man was the inverse of that. He moved quietly through a single metropolitan area over the course of 3 weeks, and when police finally caught him, It was almost by accident when they knocked on a door and the man who answered was covered in blood. Cleophas Cooksey Jr. For 3 weeks in the winter of 2017, the Phoenix area was being hunted by a man nobody had connected to anything. The bodies turned up one after another in parked cars, outside apartments, in alleys, and to the public they looked unrelated. What investigators would eventually realize was that nearly all of them traced back to a single aspiring musician, a man who was, of all things, the grandson of a respected civil rights leader. His name was Cleophas Cooksey Jr. He had been released from prison only about 4 months earlier after serving time on an earlier manslaughter conviction. Within that short window of freedom, he embarked on one of the deadliest sprees in the region's recent history. It began on November 27, 2017, when Parker Smith and Andrew Remillard were found harmed fatally in a parked car. Days later, a security guard named Salim Richards lost his life while walking to his girlfriend's apartment. Then came LaTory Beckford and Christopher Cameron, taken in separate shootings at Glendale apartment complexes. A woman named Maria Villanueva was abducted and harmed, her body left in a Phoenix alley, with evidence later directly tying Cooksey to the attack. And on December 17th, his own mother, Renee Cooksey, and his stepfather, Edward Nunn, were found shot inside her apartment. The timing of how it ended was almost grimly fitting. On that same December 17th, officers responded to a report of shots fired at his mother's apartment. When they arrived and a man came to the door covered in blood, that man was Cleophas Cooksey. The evidence stacked against him quickly. A short time later, investigators connected a single firearm to several of the killings. Then came the personal items. Cooksey was found with the car keys belonging to Maria Villanueva, and he was actually wearing a necklace that had belonged to victim Salim Richards. Police credited advanced ballistics technology with helping link the scenes together. His trial, long delayed by the pandemic, finally began in the spring of 2025. On September 25th, 2025, he was convicted of 8 counts of first-degree murder, along with kidnapping, armed robbery, and a count of attempted assault. Then, on December 18th, 2025, a Maricopa County jury handed down death sentences for 6 of those 8 killings. Jurors deadlocked on the 2 counts involving his mother and stepfather, unable to reach agreement. The county attorney summed up the case bluntly, saying that anyone questioning the need for the death penalty had only to look at what Cooksey had done. As of today, Cleophas Cooksey sits on Arizona's death row. The county attorney is still weighing whether to pursue a new sentencing trial on the 2 deadlocked counts. And as with all capital convictions in Arizona, an automatic appeal lies ahead. Cooksey's spree played out in the dry heat of the American Southwest over a matter of weeks. The next man operated an ocean away, in the cold and the rain of eastern England, and the most chilling part of his story did not arrive until almost 20 years after everyone believed the case was finished. Steve Wright. In the autumn of 2006, the bodies of 5 women began appearing around the town of Ipswich in the east of England over a span of just 10 days. The speed of it terrified the entire region. A man was caught, convicted, and locked away under an order that he should never be released. And for nearly 2 decades, that seemed to be the end of it. Then, in 2026, he did something he had refused to do for his entire time behind bars. He admitted to another killing. His name was Stephen Wright. He was a former merchant Navy chef and forklift driver who lived in the heart of Ipswich's red light district. Between late October and the 10th of December, 2006, 5 women who worked as sex workers in the area lost their lives. Their names were Gemma Adams, Tanya Nicole, Annalie Alderton, Paula Clennell, and Annette Nichols. 2 of them were found posed in a way that investigators found deeply disturbing. The hunt for the man responsible became the largest investigation in the history of the Suffolk Police, drawing in officers from multiple forces under the name Operation Sumac. The break came through forensics. DNA and fiber evidence connected Wright to 3 of the victims, and traces of blood matching one of the women were found inside his car. He was arrested in December of 2006 and charged with all 5 killings before the year was out. His trial began in January of 2008. After roughly 8 hours of deliberation, a jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict on February 21st, 2008. The judge imposed a whole-life order, meaning Wright would die in prison, and recommended he never be released. For most cases, that would be the final word. But here is where the story takes a turn that doesn't quite make sense until you sit with it. In 2019, Suffolk police quietly reopened older inquiries. Wright was arrested again in December of 2023, and in May of 2024, he was charged with the murder of a young woman dating back to 1999, along with the attempted abduction of another. At the Old Bailey in early February of 2026, Wright did something he had never done before in all his years of imprisonment. He pleaded guilty. It was the first time he had ever admitted to any offense at all. On February 6th, 2026, he received a further life sentence with a minimum term of 40 years for that killing, plus additional years for the kidnap-related counts. The sentencing judge told him that, given the sentences he was already serving, it was almost certain he would die behind bars. The prosecutor described him as someone who had stalked the streets looking for a young woman to take. He has been held at a high-security prison in central England. The Ipswich killings also changed how an entire community responded to vulnerable people. In the years afterward, Suffolk's approach shifted toward treating street sex workers as victims to be protected and supported, rather than people to be prosecuted, while focusing enforcement on the men who sought them out. An independent evaluation later judged that approach effective. Wright operated in the tight, rain-soaked streets of a single English town, picking victims from one small and vulnerable community. The final man on this list did the opposite. He used the vast emptiness of the Australian outback itself as his hunting ground, preying on travelers who were thousands of miles from anyone who might miss them. Yvonne Milat. Along a stretch of highway in New South Wales, young backpackers from around the world kept disappearing. They were the kind of travelers who told friends they would write when they could, the kind whose silence could be explained away for weeks. Then, in a dense state forest south of Sydney, the first bodies were found, and investigators realized they were looking at the work of one man who had turned the open road into a trap. His name was Ivan Milat. He was one of 14 children of Croatian immigrants, a roadworks laborer with a long criminal history and a deep fixation on firearms. Between 1989 and 1992, he approached young backpackers along the Hume Highway, offered them a ride, and took them instead into the Belanglo State Forest, where 7 of them lost their lives. The victims came from 3 countries. There were 2 British travelers, Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters, whose remains were the first to be discovered in September of 1992. There were 2 young Australians, James Gibson and Deborah Everest, and there were 3 German travelers, Simone Schmiedel, Gabor Neugebauer, and Anja Habschied. Each had set out expecting an adventure, and each crossed paths with the wrong man on a lonely road. When the bodies began surfacing in the forest, New South Wales Police formed a dedicated unit called Task Force Air. But the single most important break in the case came not from forensics, but from a survivor. A British backpacker named Paul Onions had been offered a ride by a man calling himself Bill back in January of 1990. When that man pulled a gun, Onions ran for his life and escaped. At the time, his report went nowhere. But in November of 1993, after seeing news coverage of the Belanglo discoveries, he contacted Australian police again. In May of 1994, he picked Milat out of a photo lineup. That identification cracked everything open. On May 22, 1994, around 50 officers descended on Milat's home. Inside, they recovered a chilling collection. There were possessions belonging to the victims, kept like trophies, along with camping gear and parts of a distinctive rifle hidden inside a wall cavity. To put it plainly, he had kept souvenirs from the people whose lives he took, tucked into his own home as if they were ordinary belongings. His trial began in 1996. On July 27th of that year, after 18 weeks, a jury convicted him of all 7 killings, as well as the attempted murder, false imprisonment, and robbery of Paul Onions. He was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms, with no possibility of parole. He never confessed to any of it. Ivan Milat lost his own life in custody on October 27, 2019, at the age of 74, from terminal cancer. He took whatever he knew with him, and that absence still lingers over the case today. Police long suspected he was responsible for more deaths than the 7 he was convicted of, and theories about a possible accomplice centered on one of his brothers have never been resolved. Several unsolved cases with similar patterns have been examined over the years, and searches of the Belanglo forest continued long after his conviction. As of today, no additional victims have been conclusively added to his name, and the full extent of what Ivan Milat did may never be known. 10 sprees, 10 towns that learned how quickly an ordinary place can turn into something else. Some of these men were caught by a parking ticket or a single survivor. Others were never fully understood at all. What stays, long after the headlines fade, is the names of the people who did not come home. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.